Hi, in today's video we're going to look at a fairly common NuTone 2-note long tube chime bass, which is this one right here. This is a K model chime bass. These were made right after World War II, so it's a post-World War II, late 1940s 2-note long tube chime bass. And what we have here is, this is the type that the bass will hang on the wall, sit on the wall like this, and it has these two tube hangers, and there would be two long brass tubes that hang down, and when you ring the front door, it's a two-door chime, so when you ring the front door you get ding dong, and when you ring the rear door you get a single note. So these had an option for a third tube, not every model but some of them. The third tube was purchased separately from the two brass tubes that came with the chime, and it was just decorative. It doesn't produce any sounds. This particular one has a problem that most of these have, which are the plungers inside. So this is the Solenoid Assembly. You have two electromagnetic coils inside, and then you have the top plunger here, which pops out for ding and dong. It comes out the right end and the left end, and then this bottom plunger down here just pops out to the right for a single note. And these get dirty and corroded inside and they need to be cleaned, but the way this assembly is constructed, just putting some lighter fluid inside and trying to move the plungers back and forth, that's not really good enough. It doesn't get them clean enough. It might have been okay when these were relatively new, when they were 8 or 10 or 15 years old, but at this point with their age they need to be disassembled to be cleaned properly, and that's what I'm going to show you how to do today. So the first step will be to remove the solenoid assembly from the base. The solenoid assembly here is held to the base with these two screws. There are, depending on when your chime was made, there are several different base designs, but they all fundamentally use the same solenoid assembly, and they all come off in the same way. Of course, this is the part of the video where, one, I tell you you need to be organized and keep the parts in a cup or something as you take them apart so you don't lose them, because of course, like all of these chimes, parts are nearly impossible to find. I don't have any of these assemblies laying around here. They're hard to come by nowadays, and these type of chimes are fairly well sought after, so people that have them are willing to get them fixed and keep them. Once you take the screws out, then the solenoid just lifts off the base assembly here, so that's pretty easy. This we're just going to set aside because it's the power unit or the solenoid assembly that we care about. So on the front of the solenoid assembly you have this little terminal plate assembly. It has the 3 screws for the wires that power the chime. You have a transformer connection here, and then a place where you put one of the wires from the front door push button, and a place if you have a rear door button, the wires go there. To disassemble the solenoid assembly we have to remove this plate, and this plate is held on. Basically, once you take the 2 screws out that hold it, you can see it's kind of wiggly. It's held in place with the wires that come from the electromagnetic coils inside the solenoid assembly, and the wires come through openings in the screw plate right here. So here's a hole, and you can see right here the end of the little piece of wire, and there's another one right here and another one right here, and so the wires come up through the holes and then they're soldered to fill up the holes and hold the wire in place. So to remove these, to remove this plate, we have to unsolder the wires. So when you go to desolder the wires, you have to think about the fact that the original solder is more than 60 years old at this point, and it's not going to want to desolder very well. The good way to do this is you take your soldering iron and some new solder, and you very carefully add a little new solder on top of the old solder and heat it up just a little bit, and that will help. It will flow together as it bonds, and when you go to desolder it, it'll make the solder flow better, which will make it easier to remove. like that. So now we've filled up the little divots with new solder, and now I'm going to desolder it. Now I'm lucky because I have a really professional quality desoldering tool, but I'm going to show you on one of them how you can do it yourself. And what you'll need is something like this. This is solder wick. It's woven copper braid, and it has flux in it. The flux helps it suck up the solder. And what you do is, and you can buy this if you have a store near you that sells electronic parts and things like that. You can find it there usually, or of course you can always buy it on Amazon or something like that. And the way you use this is you take the braid and you place it over the solder, the area that you want to desolder, and then you put the soldering iron on top of it, and as the braid heats up, it will soak up the solder. And since there's a fair blob of solder here, it's going to take a fairly good length of braid to soak it all up. So you just put it on top like this, put the soldering iron on it, and it begins to soak it up. And you have to move the braid along because as it soaks it up, it fills up with solder, and you need to be on a spot that doesn't have any solder, otherwise it won't soak it up anymore. If it becomes too long, you can always snip off the end, and you just work at it until all the solder is gone, like that. So this is how much braid it took. This is about 3 inches of braid. This is 2mm braid. It's not the biggest, it's not the smallest. You don't want anything too small because it'll just take more and more to get it out. And now if you look carefully, you can see there's actually a hole here in the terminal strip that the screwdriver fits down into, because we've taken all the solder out of the hole, and then the wire is just laying here. Now usually there'll be a little bit of solder left under the wire that makes it stick to the side of the hole, and that's when you use your soldering iron and you heat it up just a little bit carefully until the wire is loose like that. Again, you have to be really careful when you do this because the wire is barely long enough to come through the hole and be soldered. And I'm sure that when this was made and it was new, the wire was probably 1 inch long or so, and they fished them through the 3 holes, and then they bent it over, soldered it, and clipped off the extra. So now there's nothing to clip off. There is no extra. It's exactly the length it's supposed to be. So you have to be really careful with it. Otherwise, if you break off the wire, then you have to fix that also, and that's kind of complicated. So what I'm going to do with the other two are, I'm going to use my desoldering tool, which has a vacuum pump built into it. And that's a really fast way to desolder it. So now, see how fast that was? It's a lot faster than the braid. And if you do it a lot, like we do, it's a good tool to have, but it's not something you're going to go down and buy. But again, even with the desoldering tool, there's always a little bit left, and you got to wiggle the wire loose out of it, like that. And once the wires are loose, I think this last one is stuck just a little. It's a tricky thing, and again, it's all about being careful. Because we don't want to damage it. Okay, that's almost it. It's just hanging by a thread here. There we go. So now we got the 3 wires off, and the plate came off. You can see the 3 holes here, here, and here that the wires come through, and down here on the solenoid assembly, here are our 3 wires. There's one here, there's one here, and there's one here. We're not really going to be doing anything with the wires. We're just going to leave them where they are. You don't want to bend them around or anything like that. If the ends are a little crooked, you can simply even them up, because at the end when we reassemble it we need to put them back through the holes. So we just sort of leave them be. So we'll put this aside for right now in our cup where we won't lose it, because we don't want to do that. And once you get the terminal plate off, now we can take this assembly, it's 2 halves, and we can open it up. Usually on the end there are little slots, and if you take a small screwdriver you can kind of put it in the slots and twist it just a little to separate the 2 halves to open it up. You have to remember again, you know, this is 60 some years old, and this is the first time it's ever been apart since the day someone in Ohio made this. So you want to be careful with it. The shell is made out of metal, so it's pretty sturdy. There is a little, on the top half, there's a little bent tab right here, and the bent tab hooks over this section right here. So you lift up this end and then you slide it off. You don't want to bend it back and forth, because if you break the tab off, then that end's not going to stay tight, and that's not good. Once you get that off, then you have access to the 2 solenoids, which we're not really going to mess around with too much, and also the plungers that have the tips on them. To remove the plungers, take a small pair of needle nose pliers and simply slide them out. See, now it'll come out because it was the end of the cover that kept it from coming out before. So the top solenoid, which is for the front door, which is 2 notes, it's a long plunger assembly, and it has 2 tips on it. The tip on the left is longer than the tip on the right, and the spring is held on to the left-hand end of the plunger by a groove that's in the plunger assembly. So we'll set this aside for now, remembering how it goes, because you have to put it back together at the end. And then the bottom plunger comes out the same way, but because it's for the rear door, and the rear door is only 1 note, it only has 1 tip on it here. And then the spring assembly, which is also held onto the end of the plunger in a groove. And to prevent it from popping out to the left when it's rung, there's a little grommety kind of rubber piece right here that prevents it from coming out the end. And if this is gone, I'll show you how to deal with that. Usually if you're careful, this will be fine. Sometimes it will have sort of hardened up and broken away, and then the plunger wants to fall out, and I'll show you how to fix that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to clean the inside of the bores in the electromagnetic coils. You don't need to take the coils out of the frame. You can take them out like this if you want, but I prefer to leave them in the base because you can hold on to the base. You don't want to mess around with the coils any more than you have to, and you don't want to bend and disturb the little wires that come out of the ends of the coils, because if you break them off, it's a hard thing to fix. So what are we going to clean it with? Well, we're going to do it the traditional NuTone way. We're going to use our Ronson lighter fluid. And this is the traditional recommended way that NuTone's been saying to clean this kind of stuff since the 1930s. And when I say lighter fluid, I mean lighter fluid. This is the type that your dad or your grandpa put in his Zippo lighter and carried around in his shirt pocket with his pack of Camel non-filters, because he was probably a serious smoker. We're not talking about lighter fluid for your barbecue. We're not talking about paint thinner or lacquer thinner or acetone, not WD-40, not any of that kind of stuff, but regular old lighter fluid. You don't have to buy Ronsonol if you don't want to. You can buy a generic brand, but this is the kind I buy because there's a shop nearby that has it and I get a good deal on it. So you need that. You need some of your 2000 grit wet dry sandpaper cut into little rectangles like this so we can roll it up. And you need a plastic rod or a wooden dowel that's just slightly smaller than the bore itself so it will slide through. And what you do is you take your wet dry sandpaper and you carefully roll it up around your plastic rod or wooden dowel, and then you carefully insert it into the bore like that, just a little bit to start with. The rod fell through. There we go. And then we're going to put a little lighter fluid, and we're going to hone the inside of the bore. And honing is a fancy word for, see if I can do it so you can see it, doing this. We're going to turn it, and we're going to push it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And then we'll pull it out a little bit, and we'll put a little more lighter fluid. And we'll try not to make the whole thing pop apart. And when you do this,
I'm reminding you, check the toaster oven.
I have to go do something now. That was Alexa. I have a video that I made that shows how
I'm reminding you, check the toaster oven.
How you can use an Amazon Echo Dot with your NuTone intercom system.
I'm reminding you, check the toaster oven.
Alexa, thank you.
You bet.
Oh, she's frisky today. Okay, so you clean this like this, and as you clean it and hone it, what you're going to find is when you pull the sandpaper out, it's going to have brass shavings on it, and that's the surface of the tube inside the solenoid. And when you think it's clean enough, and it probably is, you simply put a little lighter fluid down through it like that, and that sort of flushes it out. And then the other thing I like to do is I have these little swabs on a stick. It's like Q-tips on a wooden stick, and you can do this and clean out the inside because you want to get any residue. And see, there was residue in there. So let's take another one, and we'll put a little lighter fluid on the end here. If you don't have this, if you have a Q-tip, that works fine also. The point is to get all of the buildup and crud and stuff that's inside the bore removed, because it interferes with how well the plungers slide through the tube. And while these are reasonably powerful for what they're going to be doing, they're not super powerful, and it's hard to overcome the years of grime and stuff. So I have to go check something because Alexa reminded me, and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. So I had to run. Alexa was reminding me, she's listening right now, I'm servicing a Telecron motor drive assembly out of a customer's NuTone Jefferson clock cover. We have a video in our playlist that shows you how to do this. While I had the camera off, I went ahead and cleaned the second solenoid bore, so that's all set to go. So we'll set this aside for right now because that's done. And now we're going to look at the two plunger assemblies. This is the bottom or rear door plunger, and this is the top two-note plunger. So bottom is a single note, top is ding and dong. The springs are both on the left-hand end of the plungers, and in these particular cases we need to clean the plunger rods themselves because they get oxidized and they don't slide freely. To do this, we have to remove the springs from them, otherwise we won't be able to clean its entire length. When we remove the springs, we have to be really careful with them because we don't want to mangle the springs. These springs are not available to buy. We don't have any. There's not a big enough demand for me to have 1,000 springs made for this type of chime, at least not at this point, maybe sometime in the future. But for today, there are no extra springs. So we'll take, and the other thing about this, a lot of these bases that come in, they come in because one, they don't operate correctly, and sometimes that's because these tips will have either fallen out or broken off, and then of course it doesn't hit the tubes any longer and it doesn't ring properly. If these tips are missing, again, not a part that's available, I don't even think it was a part that was available to buy when these chimes were new. You probably would have to buy the whole power unit solenoid assembly to get them, or maybe this entire plunger assembly was available as a part. I'm not sure because I don't have any part sheets on these. If these tips are missing or broken off, they can be replaced. However, it's kind of up to you, or if you send us the base assembly, we can make them. So what we usually do is we'll buy something that's slightly bigger and we'll cut it to length, and then we'll lightly sand it to make the diameter smaller. The other critical piece of information that you need to have is you need to know the length of them, because of course it always seems like the left one at the top is the one that's missing for some reason. If it's missing, you don't know how long it was, and it's actually longer than it is at this end, and if you make it's too short, it won't hit the tube. The actual measurements are, and this is the exposed part of the red tip, not including the part that goes down inside the plunger. This tip, top right, is 6.75 millimeters long. The one top left is 10.25 millimeters long, and the bottom right is 7.70 millimeters long. The very ends of them here, the part that hit the tubes, they're not flat, they're slightly convex. They're like flat points. We actually have a video in our long tube chime playlist so I talk about solenoids and the plungers and the tips and how it all goes together and things to consider, which if you're going to make some tips you should watch because it'll give you a lot of good information. But for right now what we need to do is we need to get the springs off the plungers so we can clean them. So let's put this one aside and take a look at the one for the bottom. Here's a close-up view of the end of the bottom plunger assembly. At this end we have the red tip that hits the right hand tube. Now when you're working with these you need to be really careful, because if the tips are intact you don't want to break it off, because then you've got a bigger job on your hand. So right now what we need to do is remove the spring because we need to clean the plunger. On these style of chimes, on the end of the plunger here there's a little groove in the rod, and this end of the spring is a smaller diameter than the body of the spring, and then this end of the spring is actually even a larger diameter than the body itself. The reason it's smaller at this end is when you install the spring, the small end of the coil fits into the groove, and that's what helps hold it in place. So to remove these, you have to be really careful, because if you mangle the spring or the coil of the spring and you stretch it all out of shape and it becomes too large, it won't want to fit back in the groove, and then it's going to fall off all the time, and then the chime won't work properly. So you have to be careful. I also believe, based on all of these that I've seen, that when the smallest coil on the end of the spring was originally put into the groove in the plunger, there was some type of a little bit of adhesive that was added to it, I think, to help hold it into the groove. And so sometimes you have to look for that carefully, and if it's there you have to sort of work it away. And what I use is just a really small, this is a 2 millimeter flat screwdriver, and you sort of work it through the groove in the end of the plunger to help break up whatever the adhesive was, so you can carefully work the coil of the spring out of the groove. So what I'm going to do here is, I'm going to try to do this so you can see, is I just take my screwdriver and carefully work it under the coil and pop it out of the groove, and then you kind of rotate the screwdriver around like this to pull the coil up until it comes out, and you can carefully pull off the spring. And there it is. Now of course the spring is the most lost item on any NuTone chime, so once again, get a container, put the spring in the container, because if you drop the spring on your garage floor and it bounces across and it goes under the washer and you didn't see it and you can't find it, I don't have any. You've got to make sure you don't lose the springs, because they're a valuable and important part of how the whole thing works. Now, since we took the spring off, we can actually see the whole plunger assembly, and you can see down here how it's still relatively clean, in quotes, looking, and up here it's kind of yellowed. And actually when I run my finger along it, down here finger slides pretty well. You get up here, it's kind of sticky and rough, and that's the part that makes it hang up, and that's the part we're going to clean off. Now, as it happens, on this particular one, this red tip is actually loose. So if I take the needle nose pliers, I can pull it right out. And that's not good. It's not broken off, it's just loose in the bore. And I also know, based on all of these that I've seen, when this was originally assembled, there was also some adhesive in there to help hold it in place, because if you think about it, when the solenoid energizes and this rockets out to hit the tube, there's a lot of force, and if the rod is loose, eventually it could shoot out of the end of the plunger and fall on the floor, and you'll never find it because the cat will probably eat it or hide it away somewhere. When we get done, we're going to put a little adhesive back in there. But for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this out because I don't want to lose it, and I'm going to put it, guess where? I'm going to put it in the cup with the spring. That way, I won't lose it. What do you know? So let me get set up and I'll show you how we clean this. So this is the very best way I've ever found to clean these. Take your cordless drill like this and take the plunger and put part of it in the chuck so it's tight. And then take a piece of your 2000 grit wet dry sandpaper, put a little bit of lighter fluid on it, and since it's wet dry, it's okay. Wrap it around the plunger like this and pull the trigger. Ooh, look at that. It's all shiny. And you're probably thinking, well, that doesn't look very shiny to me. I'm going to show you how shiny it is in a second. And because I like to do it thoroughly, we'll do the end a little bit. Like that. Also shiny. And then the last bit to do is fold over a clean part of the sandpaper so you've got a folded edge with grit on it, and then you can take it and put it in the groove where the spring was held in place. And clean the groove out. Now, if you do it, when you get done, what you have on the sandpaper is all of the oxidation and residue and junk that was on the plunger to start with, and now it's on the sandpaper, which is where you want it because it's not on your plunger. Now, if we take this out, and I hold it up, let me wipe it off with the rag here so it's fair. If I hold it up, this was the end that was all yellowed, and this was the end that I said, ooh, was so smooth. Now, this is all shiny, and this is all dull. And if I run my finger along it, ooh, really smooth, and get over here, oh, not so smooth, like pushing it through sand. So that's how shiny I think it probably was when it was brand new. And now we have to do the other end, and all you have to do is flip it around in the chuck. New piece of sandpaper, little bit of lighter fluid. Little honing, do the end. Like that. Wipe it off on the rag. Now, I'm pretty sure it looks like 1949 all over again. It's shiny and it's clean and it's smooth and it's ready to go. I'm going to do the other one off camera because how many times do you need to see somebody do that? The real goal here, the real test is how does it fall through the coil? Because it's got to slide through freely with no resistance and not hang up. And this is one of those kind of things that if you've done it for a long time, you know. So if you put it in like this and you drop it, it's supposed to fall right through. Like that. And that's exactly what it does. Falls right through. That's really good. I think what we'll do is before I do the other one off camera, we're going to glue our tip back in because that way it can set up a little bit while I'm horsing around with the rest of it. The best thing I found to glue the tip back in is you need a little bit of super glue. And you remember super glue. This is the kind of glue that if you get it on your fingers, it glues your fingers together, and that's a problem. It's also, remember the ads? You have the construction worker guy with the hard hat, and he put the super glue on top of the hard hat and glued himself to a steel I-beam. That's what this is. Super glue comes in a lot of different consistencies. So this is sort of your standard liquid super glue. It sort of comes out like it's watery and like that, and that's all good for a lot of things. But I like this. This is more, this is ultra gel control, and this is not as runny And I find it works better for this because it's not runny. It's more like a gelatin, hence the gel thing. Put a little bit in there. So I put a little drop in, and then we'll take our tip and make sure you get it pointed the right way because you want the pointy side out, and just insert the tip into the hole. And I always turn it just a little bit. And that's all you got to do. That'll hold it in place. If you want to be extra about it, make sure you can take a little bit and go around the perimeter of the rod next to the end of the plunger, and that makes like a little fillet of super glue also. And if I can't really show you on camera because it's too small and it won't focus, but if you look at the other one and you look really carefully, you can see the adhesive, and that's sort of how it's done. So if it was good enough for 1949, it's good enough for 2018. How about that? So that's glued back in place. This is all clean. I guess the last thing we'll do with it before we get on to the next one is we should put the spring back on. So to put the spring back on, it's pretty easy. Oh, where's our spring? Where's our spring? Oh, look, it's in our cup where it belongs. All right. See, we didn't lose it. So here's the newly cleaned and shiny plunger, and here's the little groove right here that the spring's going to go in, the end of the spring. And you take the spring, large end goes down first because the small end's going to fit into the groove. And you just slide it down carefully, and when you get down to the last coil where it's small, you take your little flat screwdriver and you try to see what you're doing and keep it on camera, and you very carefully work the coils of the spring down around until they pop into the groove. There isn't a more descriptive way to describe it than that. You just have to sort of go around and around and work it in place. And if for some reason, like this one, it doesn't quite pop in as well as I really want it to, it's reasonably snug, and you can sort of, it's going to stay on there. I think it's going to be okay. I'm going to duplicate what they did in 1949, and I'm going to take a little bit of my gel super glue and put a little dab in the groove, covering up the coil of the spring. And I don't know how much they would have put originally, but since it's easy enough to do, we'll just go all the way around with it. And that should be fine. Alright, so that one's done. So now I'm going to turn off the camera and I'm going to do the other one, and then I'll show you how to put it all back together. Here is the first plunger assembly that you saw me service and get ready to go back in. And here is the second one. I did exactly the same thing. I polished the plunger assembly in the drill just like I did in the first one. I took the spring off before I did that. I put the spring back on. I put the gel super glue to help hold the coils of the spring in the little groove, and I put little fillets of super glue around each tip to make sure they stay in place, because I don't want to see this chime again for a long time. So while all of that super glue is kind of drying, I'm going to show you two other things, because I don't want to glue my fingers together. I already got it on my glove, so what are you going to do? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about this little bump stop right here in the end of the bottom case. So this is the lower solenoid, and it's for the second door, and it only rings one note. It shoots out to the right, it goes ding, and that's all you get. When the spring pushes it back, the end of the plunger hits the bump stop right here, so it doesn't hit the other tube, so you only get one note. This little piece right here, oftentimes these are missing, or they've turned into little chunks of charcoal because they've gotten so hard and brittle that they just fall apart. And if this is missing or broken into pieces, it needs to be there, otherwise the solenoid could shoot out the end of the opening. So what I do is you can go down to your hardware store and you buy a little tiny rubber grommet. It's about the same size as the original one, but it's just sort of your standard grommety kind of grommet. And you put that in here like this, and then when we get ready to reassemble completely and you put the top of the case back on, it'll fit in the top half cut out here, and it'll be fine. And then we'll put a little super glue on that at the end. Super glue is our friend on a lot of this kind of stuff because it's easy and it's not messy, and the gel kind of get, because it doesn't get all over everything. All right, so it's home stretch time to put everything back together. So we're going to take our top plunger and put it back in the coil for the top, and we're going to take our bottom plunger and put it back in our bottom solenoid like this. Get it all sat down in there. Now is a good time to make sure that everything is going to work freely before we put the cover back on. So all you really have to do is take a screwdriver, and if you can slide it this way and it shoots back, that's good. And same for this. And that's pretty good. So you might think that we're almost ready to put the cover back on, but we have one more thing to do. We already replaced the little bump stop grommet right here, and I'm pretty sure that there was supposed to be a grommet at this opening also that has to be the right size so the red tip will slide through it. So what I do is I use the same size grommet as we used here, but the hole in it is a little small. And as I have said in other videos, the world of grommets is vast and complicated, and try to find the right size for what you're going to do. To make it work properly, I took another one, and you have to enlarge the hole in the center of the grommet. Now, there is no tried and true perfect way to do this. The way I usually do it is I have a variety of these round punches with sharp tips on them, and you usually can punch out the center, and you have to get it fairly large and try to get it fairly even. And then you have to sort of trial fit it by pulling the plunger back, putting the grommet in place, make sure that you have it lined up properly and that the tip will pop through it properly. It's kind of a trial and error sort of thing, and you may even have to put the cover on and then try it and play around with it. I know a lot of people would probably just leave it off because it's got to go through freely, and that's probably pretty close. If you can't do that, if you can't really find one or get one to fit properly, I don't think it's a fatal thing, because the end of the plunger will hit the metal case. It might make a little noise when it does that. One of the things you have to be careful of is that the shoulder of the grommet here isn't too thick, because it prevents it from popping out that thickness, and then it may not hit the tube properly. You've got to kind of play around with it to see if you can get it just right. Once you have your second grommet in place, it's time to put the cover back on. And like I said before, there's a little bent tab in this end of the cover, so you have to sort of slide that end on first and then push it down, making sure everything lines up and that you actually get the tab over the end, which I missed it the first time. Like, oops, that kind of. There we go. You got to make sure that your grommets are held in place properly. Not quite. Let's try again. Alright, like that. And then once you have all your grommets lined up and everything looks good, and I've checked to make sure that the plungers move freely, then we're going to put our little terminal block back on. And all you have to do is look carefully, and you have to get the wires through the holes. And if you didn't move them around too much, it shouldn't be too hard to do. Although seeing the wires is sometimes a challenge. And sometimes it seems like there's always one that doesn't want to come through. So there they're all lined up, and I'll take my needle nose pliers and I'll just sort of tug them up a little bit so they come through as much as they can, because remember, there's no extra. It's what it is. So we'll set that on there like that, and now it's time to resolder them. And what I'm going to do to start with is I'm just going to tack each one down. I'm not going to fill up all the holes yet because we haven't actually tried it yet. We want to make sure it works properly, because you can do all the cleaning and servicing and polishing that you want, but if it doesn't work right, it doesn't really make any difference. So there's that. And the best way to do this at this point is to put it back on the base, because right now it's all a little wiggly and you don't want anything to come apart or be a problem. So if you put it back on the base, it will be safer, and it's easy enough to do because it's only 2 screws. And I suppose that if you got it right and you did your job well, it's going to work, and you shouldn't have to take it back off the base. And you can always fill up the rest of the solder hole with solder after you've tested it. So just snug these down. They don't have to be super tight. They just have to be, you don't want it to wiggle around. So now what we'll do, I'm going to give it a quick go here. So I've got some leads hooked up to my bench power supply. We'll just touch one lead on, tell you what, we'll do it this way. One lead goes on transformer, and the other lead, rear, should be the bottom plunger. That seems good. And the center one, front, should be the top plunger. And see it's hanging up a little bit. Can you see that? See right there? It's hanging up. So now we have to figure out why it's doing that, because of course it's supposed to hit and the spring's supposed to have enough force to shoot it back the other way. So see, this is why you only tack the wires, because now I have to take it apart again and see why it's hanging up. People underestimate the amount of engineering and design that go into something like this, because it's got to work just right, otherwise it doesn't work. So let me take it apart and see what's going on with it, and I'll be right back. So after a little bit of investigation, I removed the power solenoid assembly from the base. I opened it back up and I looked, and there was a little tiny burr on the end of the tube that the solenoid wires are wound around, and when the plunger would rocket out towards the right, the little burr was catching on one of the coils of the spring, and then it was hanging up and it didn't want to pop back. So I took a little piece of sandpaper and I filed the burr down and played around with it, and now it works properly. So we have the rear, and we have the front. So now it doesn't hang up anymore. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish soldering the 3 holes, which it's not very exciting. I guess I'll show you that since I have it right here. Just take your soldering iron and your solder and carefully heat it up, put some solder, fill the hole. that easy. You don't want to overdo it. The surface tension of the solder should keep it from falling down through the hole, but you don't want to overfill it because you don't want big blobs of solder dropping down inside. You just want to fill up the hole to make sure the wires are secure. So now I'm going to mount it on our test base, and we're going to hang some tubes on it and try it out, see what it sounds like. So I've got it set up on my Chime testing base. It turns out I have to do a little reconfiguration of the Chime testing base because it was designed for a 4-wire 8-note chime setup, and it's not really wired up for a 2-note chime setup, so I'm going to have to make some modifications to it so it's easier to switch back and forth. We've got it set up temporarily on just some clip leads to show that it does work. I've got a pair of, these are K-model tubes that are from a 4-tube chime. I don't know if they're precisely the same as the original tubes, but they're probably pretty close. This one might be a little shorter, I have a feeling, but at least it gives us an idea of if it works properly or not. I also have these wooden dowels up here. That's just to pull the tubes up higher because they hang too low otherwise, and the strikers will miss the tubes. So we'll do the rear door first. And it sounds a little tinny because this tube has a crack in the top of it, so you sort of have to take that into account. But it does strike solidly, and I think it sounds okay. Let's try the 2-note. And I think it's a successful repair. I believe when the customer reinstalls it and hangs his original tubes on it, it'll sound just like it did, probably in 1949 or 1950 when it was made. That's how you rebuild an early NuTone K-model 2-note long tube chime base. I hope you found this interesting and helpful. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up on YouTube because that always helps. If you like our channel and you learn things from it, there'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell or on the wheel, put in your email address, and every time we post a new video, you'll get an email notification letting you know so you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.